I watched a movie film that I've never heard of before, and I don't think many people have heard of either. It's barely mentioned. It's not quite a conventional horror story either, which is why it's usually um I don't know. Just I mean, my opinion, it is, I suppose. I mean, it's not the okay. So it's called Werewolf. It's from 2018, and this is the thing. Despite not um no, not just saying, despite being named that, despite being named Werewolf, just Werewolf, yeah, it doesn't actually have any werewolves. It's actually a very realistic film about. I can only conclude after watching it that it's intended to be metaphorical. Like I mean, even the title itself is metaphorical. It doesn't have werewolves. It does have though dogs, um, which werewolves are supposed to arise from. So the thing is, though, I'm pretty sure I mean, it's both. It's realistic, it's mundane, but it's specific as well. I mean, it's not just you know, it's not entirely realistic, and it's not fantastic either. I mean, it's more realistic than fantastic. It's most metaphorical, but obviously the metaphor comes on top of the reality, so it's not just made of metaphor either. So it is still realistic. That makes sense. I think now it is not at all the kind of movie that one simply likes in a sense that you know one enjoys. And again, these subject matters, these topics, I mean, I don't think anyone could really say that I shudder every time people say, because I mean there's a lot of there's a variety of movies, obviously, right? But all sorts of subjects. When it comes to this, though, specifically, that is more of what happened before the most of the movie, really, not exactly what happens through most of the movie. What happens specifically, in the first 5 minutes or so. There, I mean, even then, it was just at the very end, so not exactly. So this is more of a what happened after, a hypothetical, in other words, which I don't think happens very often. Because usually it's when there's World War II movies, it's usually throughout World War II. Whether it's addressing the war aspect or the aspect of various atrocities or nuclear warfare. Usually it's mostly. I don't remember many other times when really they tackle what happened after. Now this thus in a realistic manner as well. I think. I mean, as realistic as can be. Um, as mentioned, it doesn't actually have any werewolves, but people are actually expecting a werewolf after watching it. It's like if there's anyone who honestly goes, it's a misleading title as such. They obviously didn't get the point of it. I'm assuming. No, it is a very grim film still, nonetheless. One must say. But of course, all of these topics are fairly grim. So I mean, I don't think there's anything really that isn't per se grim. Obviously there are still attempts like you know, Chaplin's movies made during the actual war, as opposed to 70 years later, like this one. I mean, Chaplin did somehow try to use comedy, and somehow it worked. Most movies aren't so about just um comedy just wouldn't work, and it wouldn't have here either. So what this does, though, alternatively, is a sort of, I mean, it's more of an internal sort of horror. The horror isn't so much with the dogs that constantly bark and seem like they want to tear everyone apart, and it's not with the corpses either. One might think that, they were either hallucinating the corpses. I thought that the first time they saw someone. I thought they were. And I mean, they might have, but in all likelihood, if this was truly set during after that is World War II, then it's not very unlikely for there to be corpses. Obviously, this was just after Russians invaded Germany, which is why there are still some Russian soldiers in the film, and is also why a German soldier is hiding somewhere afraid of the Russians. Obviously, a bit of context would be useful for anyone in such circumstances, but not absolutely necessary. I mean, the point is the psychology, really, of the people there. Um, and incidentally, now that I'm thinking of this, I don't know what happened to that. There was an adult woman at the beginning. Not sure what happened to her. So anyway, the psychology, yeah, is interesting and sad at the same time. One can imagine that something similar might have happened. I mean, unless there was something really, I think there was something organized, but um, it is possible to imagine that a few former, inmates would end up in such a house with such problems, with dogs around them, because the dogs were, of course, present also in those places before where they were. So this is the psychology behind it, I think. And what's interesting about it is the fact that, alright, so one might wonder why at the beginning they just they just destroy the mouse, right? Which is horrible. I mean, I thought at first it was just children just being mindless, but not quite, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe it could really happen, but could it really happen with such ferocity? What if, though, they are simply copying what they saw, where they came from before? That is possible. But then what's interesting is that throughout the movie, they made several attempts at either trying to tame the dogs or at some point possibly shooting them as well. At least in at least two attempts they tried that. One and the gun just fell down, and neither time they were surprised in the attic, whatever that was, and they didn't do it because of that. Um, and then of course we get that very interesting scene where the dog is exhausted. So I mean, I'm assuming some of them thought that that might have been an opportunity, but then the youngest child decides to go and take care dog, and for the first time in the movie talks and um, decides that water is what the dog needed. And that I think, you see, this is why I think it might be metaphorical, and even if it's not, even if it's not intended, I'm assuming the scriptwriters did intend it. I'm assuming there isn't quite a lot of information about this online. The page is very there's not even any trivia or anything. This is the problem with nonsense movies that exist, that are so popular. You get 250,000 raters or something. Not that ratings have anything to do with anything, but in terms of how many people watched it, I guess it's sort of a measure. And this movie didn't even have a thousand, not a single thousand. Um, yeah, I honestly don't know why. If I can find any information about the people who made it, I'm assuming that they did intend it to be metaphorical. Um, so this is the thing that I think happened. So you know, the title refers to the possibility that they themselves might become metaphorical werewolves, right? That is, uh, I mean, if, werewolves have always been metaphorical anyway. Obviously, then if you have movies where they're actually depicted, it's just sort of the metaphor projected, into fantasy, into concrete reality in the movies themselves. Um, but otherwise, it can still be metaphorical, though, just like many other legendary creatures and such. They can all be, really, mostly. But let's focus on just the werewolf for now, I suppose. So let's say the werewolf was a primal thing. Let's say a werewolf has a primal hatred, right? Shall we say? It's sort of like a algebra, what does a werewolf represent? So a werewolf could be anything. A werewolf could just be the letter W. What is W? W equals pH, right? Or something. Primal hatred, right? Anyway, let's not. Um, so, where they came from, they were surrounded by werewolves. The movie began with them being surrounded by werewolves. And then, I mean, I'm not saying that the dogs themselves have anything to do with this. The dogs they were like that. They were barking. They wanted to kill per se. Not because they had hatred, but I mean, we could just sort of project this metaphorically onto humans then. But of course, the dogs themselves only wanted to eat, just like the children themselves. So what we're seeing in a way here is a mirror. The children were very hungry themselves, they were very thirsty, and so were the dogs. And of course, when the dogs' hunger and thirst were sated, what did they do? They followed them. So essentially, the movie didn't, in fact, have werewolves, but only because they achieved this equation, this balance in nature, which is, of course, what satiation is, essentially. This equilibrium when one eats, simply put, and drinks, there's a homeostasis that one reaches. That's basic biology. So, in the movie, though, metaphorically, they could have become themselves werewolves. That is, they could have given in to their primal. In this case, it was more fear rather than hatred. But, it could be anything. It could be just these base sort of things. I mean, in this case, sure enough, if you're in a house surrounded by ravenous dogs, you will be afraid. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been, but you can see the points there. Some of them were trying to tame them, whereas some thought they might get out by um, shooting them and such, which is the primal fear being acted out. Not too dissimilar to what happened before, but of course, it is dissimilar to the extent that, I mean, in this case, they were trapped in a house. Nothing was trapping anyone else before. It was all, you know. So essentially, you could say primal hatred and primal fear are different. I mean, that's why they're called different things, but they are different. They're still connected, but different. I mean, in this case, the fear was warranted. No one is saying it wasn't. They had to fear dogs. They had to fear the fact that if they stay inside to secure their very physical being, they would just simply starve to death. So they had a few fears there. They had more than one fear essentially. Whereas at the beginning, the primal hatred was of a different nature. It's still very primal, though. It's still essentially the werewolf in action. That, well, the thing is then that despite the fear, despite this primal fear being even more necessary, even more inevitable than its hatred counterpart, than the earlier primal hatred sort of part of the equation here, they didn't act on it. So not only not only were they desperate to act on it, because otherwise they could either be torn to shreds if the dog gets to them, unless they tamed the dog, or starve, or die of thirst. Uh, so they had more of a reason to act on their so-called werewolf instincts than anyone with primal hatred would ever have. I mean, hatred makes very little sense unless the only time it makes sense is if it's in some sort of uh, method for retribution, in a way, a form of justice, not quite justice, but retribution. But other than that, if it's the initial sort of, the initial part of the equation, very primal hatred, then it makes very little sense. If it's due to, I mean, yeah, ultimately hatred is hatred. So, but suppose there are some differences as well. But anyway, this is the point. It's all about this. And at the end, there, at the very end, when they had an encounter, I mean, sure enough, it wasn't very complex. I mean, when the bespectacled child went into that cave thing and encountered that person, well, it was a strange encounter, obviously. At first, he did give him something to eat, but then apparently he realized where he was before and such, and for some reason he went insane, right? For some reason. That's when, I mean, you could say that the movie isn't quite that complex there, but then again, was reality complex? Seems not. Even reality, even history was quite simple. Seems like very simply destructive. World War II, of course, being the most destructive war ever. So, in a way, it represents reality. What happened? Not very much unlike reality. Then, but then, what was interesting is how he followed them, the forest thing, and the dogs were attacking him. But then they used their newfound taming capabilities to stop them. So not only did they not become metaphorical werewolves against the dogs themselves to get out of their sordid situation, they actually stopped the dogs becoming werewolves themselves. Essentially, this is what's interesting. For all I know, the creators and the director and the writers just didn't think of any of this and just thought, yeah, let's just do this, and then they tamed them and such, and didn't think anything beyond this. Nothing about, well, no likelihood, nothing about equations, but it still fits. When something still fits, this makes sense. And so it is interesting, I thought, that not only did they stop themselves from becoming werewolves against the dogs, they also stopped the dogs from becoming werewolves, metaphorically, against the primal hatred. So essentially, we end up with the primal hatred at the end, just there, laying down, not acting on the primal hatred because they've been essentially defeated, but just there. Not even totally destroyed, just there in the hope that somehow primal hatred will reconcile with itself, realize something, who knows? I mean, this is a movie, obviously, made 70 years or even more after World War II. I'm not sure if it's based on any real story. Can't find much information about it, but it's fiction essentially, and obviously it's just anyone can just think of whatever, but it makes sense. It really does make sense, and as opposed to movies, others like I'm just mentioning similar sort of movies here. So obviously there's many movies about this subject, but other sort of similar movies. I think the most famous would be Boy in a Striped Pajama, and that is that is not as metaphorical, as much more. It obviously wants to make an impact, whereas this is more just a slice of life essentially, and it just wants to show how they could possibly survive day to day or not. I'm honestly surprised, honestly, um, uh, that nobody has committed suicide or such. I thought at one point, at several points actually, somebody would. At one point, I'm not sure if they. In fact, at several points throughout this film, I thought that the bespectacled guy was hallucinating, and I'm still not sure if when some group of people told him to jump, maybe that happened, right? I'm not hallucinating myself as far as I know. No, and he didn't do that, but who were those group of people then? I mean, I don't suppose they were the group of people that he was with. Otherwise, it would make no sense for him to return to them if they could say that. So I don't quite get that. Was that a hallucination, or wasn't it? What's also interesting about this film, by the way, is the fact that we're dealing with such subjects, such psychology of suffering, within the context of these lofty sort of mountains of trees and greenery. There's actually a lot of places in this world where it's sort of like that, kind of like Kashmir, and somehow there's still conflict and bloodshed. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense how people cannot just simply enjoy that, and and but no, they'd rather just fight. rather close their eyes to everything around them and just fight each other. Makes very little sense. But that's just my musing, I guess. But that's what's interesting though. Still, so we get these sort of things, as opposed to just suffering and the external environment reflecting that suffering. I mean, the house sort of did, and then at one point they were destroying a lot of stuff as well, plates and everything. I'm assuming that's sort of. I mean, I suppose might be going a bit too far to say it might be metaphorical or such because children like to destroy stuff. I suppose it's and especially if it doesn't belong to them. Yeah, why not? But one might think it might have something to do with the fact that it's presumably it was a grand house that they were living in. For some reason it ended up empty, and there was a lot of stuff, but what there wasn't, of course, was what they needed, what everyone needs: food and water. So that's very ironic in itself, how you could be in such a big house and everything, and that obviously at the end of the war, I think realistically it could happen, but so this is the thing. So it's there are multiple layers. I don't think there aren't. So yeah, I'm thinking that maybe they destroyed plates and everything. Well, besides the fact they didn't actually have much use for them. Possibly also though because they wanted to reflect externally what's internal. Obviously, as I said, this might be going too far with the symbolism and metaphors, but I'm just saying, I mean, they couldn't quite, chop down trees or such to make it reflect what's internal. So instead, they destroyed plates. I mean, I think it works as well in terms of catharsis. When you don't have anything to eat and drink, so might as well just destroy plates. Why not? But yeah, ultimately, um, I think this is it's interesting. It's not well known at all, though. I find it's apparently there's a few reviews scattered, and only one review seems to think that it might be metaphorical. None of the others seem to think so. There must have been a few people who thought it would actually have werewolves, which is absurd. As I said at the beginning, anyone who watches this and still thinks that has some absurdity. Anyway, yeah, it was interesting, and obviously also dark, but not quite as dark as obviously the darkest sort of movies made about this subject matter would be set within, not outside. But it's still, I mean, it's still haunting. There's still ghosts around. The dogs are sort of symbolic of such ghosts, and but it's still interesting as to what it says. It's also useful that it was done in the original Polish, which it likely would have been spoken, and it gives it a much more realistic sort of tone. And also the music was really brilliant. It was so atmospheric, so appropriate, I thought. Yeah, it sort of reminded me of this short Asma movie called Frat. And the music is similar, but also the story just a bit, not quite identical or anything, but it's also metaphorical, and it's about similar sort of, well, not exactly specifically the topic, just at a more abstract level. I mean, this short animated film is more fantastic rather than realistic, but yeah, it so did that, but that's interesting. I mean, so yeah, and the cinematography, of course, something to point out. As I mentioned earlier, though, it really worked out with the story, sort of balanced each other out, sort of like yin and yang. So overall, yeah, it was, it made for an interesting film, really. Certainly better than the recent ones that I watched.